Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's a few minutes after the hour. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jamie Wheeler and I'm the Senior Vice President of Clinical Affairs at Edwards Life Sciences. I'm also a member of the Executive Planning Committee for MedTech Color Collaborative Community. And to be inclusive of anyone who's joined us today who may be visually impaired, I may be described as an older white female dressed in business attire, but I can assure you that I am still very young at heart. So with that, if we can switch to the next slide. MedTech Color is an organization focusing on the advancement of people of color in MedTech. MedTech Color has convened this collaborative community to create a forum where MedTech professionals and other stakeholders can address minority health issues and medical device product development and clinical research. We develop strategies, resources, best practices, and thought leadership to increase awareness and mitigate the impacts of unconscious bias, social determinants of health, and lack of inclusion or consideration of racial and ethnic minorities in critical aspects of the product development lifecycle. We would like to thank the Evidence Development Subcommittee of the Collaborative for helping to produce the discussion today. And I'd now like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Paul Copeland, to introduce himself and our discussants. Paul.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Jamie. My name is Paul Copeland. I'm, for those who are visually impaired, I'm a male wearing a sports jacket and a shirt. I'm in Philadelphia at the moment, and I work for Johnson & Johnson, where I lead the medical device epidemiology and real-world data sciences team. We have a cross-functional team that works on real-world evidence as it pertains to diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as working on clinical trial diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm happy to be representing that team today. So I would, today we will be talking about the use of real-world data, what are the challenges to using it, and how can we mitigate those challenges from the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll have the opportunity for participants to ask questions at the end of the discussion. Please submit your questions in the QA box as we move through the discussion. I'm delighted to invite our panelists to come on camera and introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Dr. Malone from the FDA.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Misty Malone, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Peripheral Interventional Devices team in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices at FDA. And for those who are visually impaired, I am a white woman with long brown hair, and I'm wearing my scarf today. So I'm not sure how much you wanted me to go into my background. Sometimes folks don't know what we do at the FDA, but my group reviews a variety of peripheral and coronary interventional devices. You may have heard of stents, angioplasty devices, hypertension treatments, and various other devices. I'm also actively involved in collaboration supporting global clinical device evaluation and real-world evidence to support clinical and regulatory decision-making. And this includes recognition of disparities in these diseases, particularly in chronic limb-threatening ischemia, and treatment strategies and clinical evaluations. Thank you.
Thank you, Misty. Dr. John George.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for having me as part of this webinar. I'm John George. I'm an interventional cardiologist and endovascular medicine specialist here in Philadelphia at Pennsylvania Hospital. I would describe myself as a brown-skinned male. I'm wearing black scrubs today in front of an exposed brick facade. So I do all kinds of vascular interventions from head to toe, but I'm very passionate about diversity and equity within the clinical trial arena and research arena. And so I'm excited to be participating in this discussion today.
Thanks, Dr. George. And Jamie.
Okay, so again, Jamie Wheeler. I am located in California. I did not say that before. That's where Edwards is. I've had a little over 2 decades in clinical research, predominantly cardiovascular research, also predominantly medical device research. So when it comes to clinical trial design, execution, and trying to make improvements for bringing minoritized communities in off the sidelines, I am very passionate about that. We've been working for probably a decade, really earnestly trying to make changes. And I'm really happy to be on the call today. And I hope that we can turn this around and really start making some differences as a team. So thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. So we'll turn to our first question. So it is, how is real-world data being used to support clinical studies to enroll diverse patients? And Misty, I wonder if you could start in responding to that, and then we'll go to Jamie.
Sure. So I'll start with, in CDRH, we've often been told, do we accept real world evidence? And I'm very happy in 2021, we published 90 examples. And these are just illustrative examples to show how we use real world evidence to support regulatory decision making. And they vary across device types, a diverse array of data sources, including electronic health records, registries, administrative claims, pharmacy data, even wearables. Most of us are wearing some sort of device on us, and patient-generated data. And while many of these data sets are very large, and so they allow evaluation of diverse patient groups. And so in addition to evaluating these diverse patient groups, these real-world data sources can be also used to identify patients in specific patient populations, such as pediatrics or with rare diseases, in order to support a clinical trial. So real-world data sources, they have a use beyond just seeing the data's in them, but also finding those patients that may be difficult to include in a clinical trial. And I also wanted to point that the FDA has drafted a guidance that supports sponsors in developing medical products to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials. Although this guidance is still in draft, it encourages sponsors to submit plans to help ensure the adequate participation of these patients in clinical trials, which can include offering financial support or support getting to the trial. And I believe this has encouraged our companies to help enroll these patients and evaluate them both in the pre-market, but also consider these patients in the post-market, particularly as many of these trials, in order to get devices to patients sooner that are safer and effective, we may have smaller clinical trials. And so we may look at these patients in the post-market. And so real-world data sources offer the opportunity to collect this data in real-world patients that we may not have been able to enroll in the pre-market study.
Thank you, Misty. Jamie?
Yeah, so in addition to what Dr. Malone just shared, in terms of the types of different real-world tools, one of the things that I think industry is moving to fairly rapidly is moving, in addition to looking at outcomes from the tools, we're now moving towards access for patients by utilizing the tools. And so if we go a little bit further, what we mean by this is when you start talking about wearables, or when you start talking about the use of telehealth medicine and an iPad, you could do something as simple as open access to a clinical research study or to healthcare for a patient who previously could not step away from work, come in for the multiple clinical trial visits that are required for participation, and instead perhaps ship them an iPad and help them use telehealth for participation, electronic informed consenting. We open more doors by being able now to utilize this tool and gain access to these participants. Another example that we're seeing now is also algorithms. So there's lots of electronic health data sets that Dr. Malone mentioned, right? Whether you're looking at national registries, different countries now have registries. It can be Social Security death indexes. Hospitals have their own electronic health record systems. But what we find is everyone faces inherent biases, whether they're conscious of them or not. An algorithm can actually be developed that we can work with site IT departments to deploy throughout one of their databases, where it actually might look at certain parameters of a disease state, has nothing to do with ethnicity, but just the disease state characteristics that maybe is being treated in a clinical trial. We can deploy these algorithms and actually help the site identify patients that may be within their care or within a referring hospital or a network that they can go out and source to actually screen for the trial and open up access. So it's pretty unique how we're now starting to be able to utilize these tools.
Excellent. That sounds very exciting. Dr. George, have you been involved in any clinical studies at the hospital?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, recognizing some of these inherent biases within these clinical trials, I think is first and foremost in trying to figure out what can be done differently. And so really looking at the demographic data of patients that come into these clinical trials is important to facilitate future changes. And so looking at, more than just gender and race, socioeconomic status, and, where they're coming from to participate in these trials. And so geography and even access, transportation, and all of those things come into play in even when you design these clinical trials and recruit patients to participate in these trials, as you'll hear from every one of these panelists.
Thank you. So the next question is about understanding inequities in access and the use of medical devices. Could you talk about how you and your team are using real-world data or real-world evidence to understand inequities in the use of medical devices and difficulties in access or inequities in access? Jamie, would you start on that?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so let me break down an example that we've been struggling with over the last couple of years, and some changes that we're making as a result of using real-world data. And that is, in our particular space, we are under a national coverage decision in the United States, which means there are certain volumes of usage that have to be in place in order for a site to have access to our technology. Once the site meets those volume requirements and they have access to the technology, any recipient of the technology then has to go into a national database. It's not something where we enter the information, but the hospital themselves put the data in. What we have now been able to use is, over the years with the data being put in, we're starting to analyze the data, instead no longer looking specifically at outcomes, but now who has access to the product, who's receiving the product. And we've been able to visually see in the US very clear patterns of access and lack of access by zip codes or by areas. And so what this is now enabling is a change in the dialogue that we're able to have, not just with FDA and CMS and the hospitals themselves, but as we're recruiting the research sites to participate in the clinical trials, we can show them on a map their catchment areas, what their catchment areas might look like. So a zip code assessment of the types of patients that should be around them, right? And we can show them what they should be recruiting based on the prevalence rate of their disease state in a trial versus what they're not recruiting, or maybe they are recruiting. Some sites do this very, very well. And it's actually, in addition to one of the plans that Dr. Mullen mentioned, like these diversity plans that FDA has just put out, it's helping us change the way that we're looking at sites and interacting with sites to say, what you may be enrolling in a clinical trial isn't actually matching the representation of the community around your hospital. And we're starting to be able to have different conversations about why that is and how we can change that. And we're starting to see some changes in terms of the types of patients that historically have not been recruited into the clinical trials. It's starting to change just a little bit. And we hope now with these new diversity plans that over the next 3 to 5 years, we start to see really meaningful changes as a result of being able to just use something as simple as a national registry, a real world data tool.
That's excellent and really groundbreaking work.
Thank
you. John, is that something you could address? Of using real world data to understand equities in the use of medical devices? Is that something that that the hospital looks at in any way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it is something that the hospital looks at, and as investigators, we also look into. But as was mentioned, because of the locations, the geographic location of where a hospital is, the attraction for patients into that particular locality for a clinical trial varies. And so, being located in a suburban setting as opposed to a metropolitan setting, being located in in an area where there is an increased prevalence of a disease state as opposed to something else that you're recruiting for makes a big difference into who gets recruited into those trials. Now, having said that, there's also people that are willing to travel distances to be enrolled into a cutting edge clinical trial. Now, that alone biases the patients that will be capable of doing that and being able to travel for being enrolled in a trial with a new device when you're limited at the number of sites where such a trial would be available. And so a lot of different factors play into this. And I think someone mentioned earlier about potential incentives to try to excite patients to be part of some of these studies where we really need to be focused on certain population subsets. But then there's also the question of whether you're inducing people, or incentivizing too much to bias in the opposite direction. And so there's a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration, and what these confounding factors could be within a trial that could affect what the outcomes would be shown, how the outcomes would be portrayed, depending on who's recruited into that trial. So these are definitely aspects that are looked into. Whether we have the magic answer of how to be, diverse enough and being able to be inclusive enough of all the patients within that specific disease subset that's being studied is a question that needs to be asked and answered. Yeah.
That does get at the question of what does good look like, and how do we set a target of or benchmark for what that we should be striving towards.
Absolutely.
Our next question is, how are you using real-world data to understand the difference in outcomes of medical devices in race and ethnic groups or gender groups? And particularly if you're looking at social determinants of health and then looking at really, and so understanding whether the medical devices work differently. We saw one example published on that, which was for a pulse oximetry device that used the color of, the premise of the mechanism of action of the device was detecting differences in color of blood, and that turned out that skin color influenced the reading of oxygen saturation, and the number of patients who with darker skin included in the trial were not enough to really pick up that difference. And so when pulse oximeters was used to determine which patients get hospitalized during the COVID era, darker skin patients tend to be less hospitalized because the bias of the pulse oximetry device was to show better oxygen saturations in people with darker skins. So it was an example that clearly had impact on clinical outcomes. So to avoid that in the future, how are you looking at real-world data to understand difference in outcomes? Misty, perhaps you could share your perspectives.
Sure. So that was a two-part question. I'll answer the first part, and then I'll get to the pulse oximeters because it's very interesting concern. Because in the Office of Device Evaluation, we're evaluating a safety and effectiveness of the device. And so the companies are submitting data up to us, and is this device safe and is it effective? And many times it may be challenging to figure out, will this effectiveness be generalizable to the entire real world? And real world evidence helps to then support, are there patient populations where this device is more effective or less effective? And then the companies can use that data to tweak their device, or we can use it to put out communications, such as we did with pulse oximeters. So in the chronic limb-threatening ischemia space, which is something I'm very interested in because there are no devices to treat those patient population. Many of these patients have wounds unhealing wounds and ulcers on their legs, and there's about a 50% mortality rate after 2 years. So these patients need help. And evaluating real-world evidence, we support some of the research that's been evaluating insurance claims and CMS claims, and they've shown that there's a 6 to 9 times rate of amputation in Black Americans. And so why is that? What is causing that? Are these patients showing up later in their stage of disease? Is there something that we could learn about their disease to help then find the right treatments for these patients? So I think becoming aware, the awareness is growing in disparities across the country. I see it as a session more often at conferences. So I appreciate sessions like these, because we need to be aware of these so that way we can then make the changes that we need to help support clinical decision making, so that clinicians and patients know what they need to do. Regarding pulse oximeters, FDA became aware of this issue, and we've put out communication since then, recognizing that this was a challenge in the data and how the device was evaluated early on. Patients with thicker skin, darker skin, the device was less effective. So recognizing some of these challenges and how we can overcome them. It's actually mentioned in the draft guidance that I referenced, our diversity plan, that that sponsors and industry should consider this up front. How will the device be used in patients of different groups with different lifestyles and different attributes and characteristics? So I think it's something we're thinking of more, and as the disparities comes more to the forefront of our mind, I'm hoping the device evaluation will improve, or at least we can have really transparent labeling to understand where it is effective and maybe where it isn't. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, because this is very interesting when it comes to machine learning and AI devices. So the training sets for these devices, what are the biases that are being used to train these devices? If we're only treating one particular patient population, that machine learning, that program is being trained on, or that algorithm is being trained on our current biases. So how can we ensure that it's capturing the wide range of treatments rather than continuing our current biases in treatment paradigms? So that's been interesting, and there's been some good practices documents to published by multiple regulatory authorities to consider these early on when developing training and developing algorithms.
Algorithmic bias. Dr. George, would you like to talk about how you're looking at social determinants of health and the outcomes associated with medical devices?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Misty mentioned it. It's really looking at the relevant data and analyzing that data and figuring out what the differences are in outcomes based on the patients enrolled into these trials, and to figure out if this has an implication for clinical practice. I think a lot of times, I think recognizing the fact that there are biases, as was mentioned, is step one, and it's very easy to miss that. And it's very easy to just extrapolate the results of the data that we do have to all aspects of the population, but it may not necessarily translate. And so recognizing that there is a deficit and there are disparities, and looking for that in the data set is key. And then subsequently looking at how those could be modified and changed and extrapolated appropriately would be the next step, and whether that involves doing additional studies versus specifically looking at a patient subset versus trying to find ways to recruit more patients from a different population subset. All of those come into play as steps 2, 3, and 4. And so I think the main part of this is education and recognizing that there are inherent biases.
Agree. Thank you. How are you using real-world data to augment gaps in clinical research? Jamie, could you talk about what your practice has been at Edwards, or any of the MedTech Color activities in this area?
Sure. So one of the ways that we're using the real world evidence or data right now, going back to say this national registry where we can clearly see that we have predominantly white or Caucasian data and much smaller rates of other ethnic minorities, and the smallest one being Black participants when we look at the US population of what Black participation should be. So if we've got 13% of people living in the US are Black, and we're running at maybe 3 to 4% participating in this data set, right? So receiving this device, we've now taken a different approach to how we're designing the clinical trials. And so one of the things that we're doing is, having had a number of conversations with physicians, we don't believe that it's just that this particular ethnic group isn't having this issue. We actually believe they haven't had access. So I talked about some of the ways that we're trying to garner access for them. But instead, now what we're doing is designing, and we've just finished this, we've designed a clinical trial that, instead of working with this patient population at the point in time of a procedure, when it's scary in general because you've got a health crisis, you're being faced with a 27-page informed consent form, and maybe being asked to enroll in an investigational medical device study. In our case, we've tailored that model for just a second. We've moved it further upstream to where we go to these health screening type trials, where we're actually working with the patients or participants much earlier on in the product life cycle before they are ever afflicted with the disease. And we're teaching them, in our case, about heart health, things that they can do to become more cardiovascular healthy, questions they can ask their physicians, tests that they can be aware of, or diagnostics that they should be aware of as they progress through their life cycle. So at the point in time that they may actually need access to any one of these cardiovascular products, they've already been through the journey. And when they're being asked to enroll in a clinical trial or to receive a medical device, it's not so foreign. And so that's how we're trying to change just a minor way of how we're conducting research to bring patients in off the sidelines way further upstream.
Excellent, thank you. That's good, really good idea. Have you found patients responsive to that kind of early disease engagement?
Surprisingly so. So we just finished a 500 patient study on this, and we're working now to get a manuscript out. And it was mind blowing for us. So prior to this, we ran what I would call a failed study, where we specifically had targeted, it was a registry for 100 Black patients, and we had gone to minoritized communities. We paired them up with a sister site that was super experienced, and we thought this should be easy, right? Protocols were aligned, everybody was on board, and we did not get the enrollment that we thought. And this was working in our case with the Association of Black Cardiologists and world-renowned KOLs and clinical trial design experts in hospitals that were on board, and we couldn't get the patients to want to enroll or to drive to these other sites. By changing the model now and going so much further upstream, we have 100% follow-up at the 30-day follow-up point for this particular screening study, which I've never had in any trial. And almost all of these patients continue to contact us and this third party that's working with us to say, when are you going to do more of these? I learned so much. I want my friends and family to come and participate. And so the doors that it opened just by changing the way we approach somebody so much further upstream has blown our minds, in terms of that's a much different way of approaching somebody than the traditional ways that we've been trying to do it in clinical trials. So we've learned a lot.
It's very interesting. One of the things that we held two think tanks with subject matter experts on how to increase diversity in clinical trials. And one of the things I said is to try and engage the community and even the family, since often the decision making is a more you have to build trust, not just in the individual, but the community. Do you extend that education to family members? We
did, friends and family. So it was participants, and they could bring friends and family. So when they were walking in, could have been spouses, they could have brought a parent, they could have brought their kids, depending on ages. And that, I think, actually helped, because even what we saw during the informational sessions when they had Q&A with physicians, the one participant, maybe a male, would say, no, that's never happened to me. And the wife would hit him on the shoulder and say, that's not true, that has happened. And so what we found, right, by having the family involved, that extended nucleus, we got much more information, and people were so much more transparent because we had that help.
Interesting. So So, Dr. George, you have two hats in this panel. One as an investigator and one as a clinician treating patients. If you could put your your clinician hat on for a moment. When you are treating patients with medical devices, what do you need from real-world data or studies to help inform your clinical decision-making around issues of race and ethnicity and gender differences?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. And I think it comes down to what your clinical practice looks like, right? As a physician or a practitioner, what is the makeup of your own clinical practice? And those are the patients you're trying to apply any data that you take in from clinical research. And so it's important to figure out that first and then find data that's applicable to the patients that you're trying to treat. And so sometimes that's trying to reach out of just IDE and randomized clinical trials, and is looking at observational studies within communities. You're looking at investigator-sponsored research trials and the data that produced. You're looking at post-market studies within specific patient subsets. And so if you're doing like a hypertension trial and you're trying to treat a patient with high blood pressure, and we know that the prevalence of hypertension is extremely high within the African American population, but the trials that you're looking at or trying to glean information from is not necessarily representative of that, then it becomes hard to apply that information in your clinical practice. And so I think to do this in clinical practice is to really absorb as much of this data from different subsets, find what's applicable to the patients that you are treating. And I think, there's a couple of mentions about artificial intelligence and AI in this current era. And I think it's going to become simpler because in the future, because we're going to have computers digesting this data for us, and perhaps all we have to do is ask a question for a particular patient subset, and it'll pool together data for you to be able to see what the implications are within that subset. And so maybe that's where we're headed, but analyzing these large data sets, being able to figure out what's applicable to your patient subset, combining, the combination of data from clinical trials and other studies that have been done, maybe even in single centers or in particular geographies that are more inclusive, perhaps, of patients within that community, all come into play when you're trying to apply it into clinical practice. As a clinician, I'll tell you that half the time, what we're practicing in real world is outside of the stringent confines of a clinical trial. And so we have to take our minds outside of that and be able to extrapolate that data for practice.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important point. Misty, you mentioned that the FDA has released the guidance on diversity and equity and inclusion in clinical studies of medical devices. And you also mentioned the document in which FDA described 90 cases in which real-world evidence has been used to support regulatory decisions up until 1919. I'm hoping we see an update because things are changing so fast in real-world evidence. So for this guidance, do you, in helping companies and sponsors meet the requirements of this guidance, do you see real-world data as playing a useful role in meeting the recommendations of the guidance document?
Yes, and it's even called out in the guidance document to think beyond just clinical trials when considering evaluation of a diverse patient population and different subgroups. As I mentioned, it may be, we're trying to get devices to patients that need them, and particularly in the peripheral arterial space, there may not be a lot of patients available. We have some devices that are being studied to treat critical limb ischemia. And as I mentioned, those patients have a high mortality rate. There's nothing available. And so when thinking about a diverse patient population, they may not be able to collect all that data pre-market because the trials are so small. Those pre-market studies may only be hypothesis generating. If you have 10 patients in one category and 10 patients in another, you may not be able to make statistical inferences from the data sets. However, if the company can then plan to keep evaluating their device post-market and how is it working in these patient populations? Have they started moving to sites that may not be the gold standard site for a clinical study, but it's in a real world patient population being used by real world clinicians? How is that? Is the device still safe and effective? And so that may be accomplished with real world evidence. It may be accomplished with literature. There's a variety of means to address that diversity plan. And we do hope to collect as much data pre-market as possible, but we also recognize that we don't want to hold up novel, very, very safe or effective devices because we need all the data at the beginning. So we are considering, I think real world evidence is a great option here. There are national registries. In cardiovascular space, we're very fortunate to have a number of registries. In other spaces, there are registries that are getting up and running. And I think it's important to understand, if you ever start working with real world data, to understand that there are limitations. There are very large data sets, but there may not be as long a follow-up, or there may be some missingness, but recognizing these limitations. And over the past decade, I've seen registries really improve in quality. I think we're getting there, that we can continuously evaluate these devices across the total product lifecycle.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems, I like that point about the quality of the data improving. So as FDA starts to accept and use data, then it incentivizes that data to improve in quality. Jamie, could you talk about how industry is reacting to the new FDA guidance?
Sure. Given FDA is on the call, I would say that we're reacting very well to the new guidance. But in all seriousness, like most things, when FDA puts something out, it takes everybody a little bit of time to figure out how best to deploy it within their systems. I think everyone is working through that right now. One of the big conversations that we've been having as we've been working on utilizing these diversity plans, which we're actually excited to have, is it doesn't have to be perfect on version 1. Stop, let's just think through, where do we want to start? How do we build this into the programs with the understanding that we're going to learn over time? We're not going to be afraid of what it tells us. This is an evolution, it's a journey, but it actually, as we're starting to think through how to roll these out across the different programs, it's changing the dialogue. It's changing the participants who are coming to the table and saying, oh, I have an idea. Have you considered this? Oh, maybe your data says X, we should be doing Y. So we're reacting very well to the diversity plan. My counsel to everybody is start, don't be afraid of it, and don't think it's going to be perfect from day one. Put it out there and keep evolving it and keep pulling people into this discussion and this change, because it's critical that we start.
Thank you. So we have a question in the Q&A from one of the organizers and audience. Marley asks, what do you see as hurdles and opportunities for smaller researchers that want to utilize real-world data to support research?
Maybe I'll take a first pass stab at that. Hurdles would be familiarity and understanding the limitations of your data sets. Sometimes, right, when you're new or you're small and you don't have lots of individuals who can help give input or run different types of analyses, you may not understand exactly what the data is, and you may just take it at first pass. And the hurdle is think through it, try to understand the limitations and how you would apply it to whatever it is that you're trying to utilize that data set for. The second hurdle, which is also a benefit, is don't be afraid of what that data says. Again, lots of times in clinical research, We've all been trained to always make sure that everything is perfect, because if FDA comes in for an inspection, everything's got to be perfect. It's not going to be in this endeavor. When we're utilizing real world data sets, there is no perfect data set, and it's incumbent upon all of us to try to utilize them and to understand the limitations, but to also extrapolate what meaningful data we can to add to the body of evidence that we're trying to generate to get meaningful evidence out. And what I mean by get meaningful evidence out the door, a lot of minority communities or minoritized patients don't even have manuscripts that give them any information about how a device or a pharmaceutical may work in their particular ethnic population. We've got to change that with journal editors on down to everyone in the ecosystem to say, put some information out. Again, it's not perfect on day one, but people need access to information so we can see where the gaps are to keep trying to fill it in through different sources of media. So that's one hurdle, but it's also an advantage if you can add it to your total body of evidence.
Thanks. Misty, do you have any suggestions for smaller scale researchers?
So we've had the pleasure of working with a number of academic researchers with real world data sources. And I'm part of a multi-stakeholder collaboration that includes folks from regulatory bodies, academics, clinicians, industry, statisticians. Don't want to forget them, because when we're dealing with real world data, it's important to have the statisticians involved to help understand and parse the data out. So we have found some challenges with access to the data, but like Jamie said, going in and understanding the limitations of what you got is really helpful. If you can look at it and go, all right, I'm trying to understand this question. Here's the data I need. And does this data tell me what I need? There may be some missing information, but you may still have information that's very valuable. As a small example, we recently, I think it was last year, approved a panel track supplement for a PMA for a carotid stent. And they used real world evidence to support the standard risk patient population. And it was a very, very large data set, and we would like data out to 12 months. Well, there was about 70% missingness at 12 months. And so we needed to understand if that 30% of data that had complete data was biased in any way. So they were able to compare those patients to the patients who had missing data. Were they different? Were there different characteristics? Were there different disease states? And so then we gained confidence that no, this missingness was really at random. It happened for various reasons. And this 30% of data that we do have is extremely valuable to answer that question. So going in there, understanding the limitations and being able to do additional analyses to build confidence that that data means what you think it means.
I think that's a great point. Because it seems that there's so much valuable information available on real world evidence, but it's never quite perfect. And so the ability to pass through when it's helpful and valid enough versus not is a special skill, I think. I'm working on the NEST data quality framework, where we're looking at establishing like a set of criteria in collaboration with FDA and industry and academics, and coordinated by NEST, about how do we determine that data has quality that's sufficient for its purpose, and that it always comes down to a judgment call, like and how do you, we've been thinking about how do we create a set of rules by which you can determine when it's fit for purpose and when it's not. And how that bar shifts depending on the application. If it's a label extension of effectiveness, it's much higher than if it's a post-marketing safety follow.
The other thing, Paul, that I just thought of, right? If you're a smaller, actually, even if you're a bigger entity, run a pilot. So we learned a lot through pilots on wearables with our patient population, and things that we thought would be easy, maybe not so easy for an 85-year-old when you give them an iPad. Or a pilot for the health screening surveys, right? When we did our first one, we thought certain things were going to happen. Didn't quite work the way we planned. Do a pilot before you go big, and then you can really quickly adopt the changes.
Great point. I wanted to, we received some questions before the meeting started. So they're not in the Q&A, but they were listed and collected by Danielle, one of our meeting organizers. And so one of the questions that came in from that is, I think it's something, Misty, you've already touched, but I just wanted to make sure, as AI and prediction models become more common, how do we remove inherent biases that the model fits?
An excellent question. I don't review these devices. I'll start off with that, but I asked some of my colleagues who are deeply involved in digital health and helping to understand machine learning and AI and develop a predictable pathway. For these devices, we typically have a number of conversations with companies regarding not only their device and their plan, but those training sets, and that there's continuous updating and plans to evaluate these data sets and the training and the outcomes over time. So software, unlike say creating a device and just selling it forever and never changing it, which doesn't happen, machines and software is going to be continually updated. So developing a development plan to continually evaluate those software and the outcomes. And I think we may have a guidance on that, or unless one comes out, but again, not my area of expertise.
We have a question for Dr. George. Thank you for that. Do you find that your facility is willing to support real-world data using hospital-based data? And does the hospital have the resources internally to analyze it? If not, is the hospital and the hospital leadership willing to partner with industry to conduct the research?
Yeah, so again, a multi-part question, but as far as the hospital's willingness to support real-world data based on internal data, just the hospital-based data, I think that the answer is yes. I think most hospitals are willing. It's relatively straightforward these days with the electronic medical record, where you can actually mine the data set within the hospital relatively easily. I think the harder part is having someone pose a question and be a champion to try to retrieve that data. But I think the hospitals would be supportive of that. I come from an academic hospital setting where we definitely have the infrastructure to be able to do these things. And then I think the next part of the question is about the resources to be able to do that. And we do, and I think that's where the difficulty comes in, where depending on the hospital or depending on what the makeup or the infrastructure is at that particular hospital, you may or may not have those resources. And that's just manpower to mine the data, perhaps, versus having the electronic support to be able to mine an electronic medical record and to analyze it. And so having the research staff support versus having even, coming from a training program where we train fellows and residents, there's always people that want to do research and want to be able to ask questions and answer questions and publish. And so we have a lot of help to be able to do that if the appropriate question is asked and you have the resources to conduct it. And then finally, would the hospitals be willing to partner with industry? That comes down to what that partnership involves, right? I think the hospitals always want to be at an arm's length, partnering with industry with all the disclosures that are required, and depending on how the funding comes in and how that's delivered and all of those things. But if that can be outlined clearly and can be agreed upon, I don't think it's a limitation, because they always do that for clinical trials, but it requires more hoops to jump through to clarify that relationship on paper, so that there's no other interpretations of that data that's gathered based on these arrangements. So yeah, in general, I think hospitals are willing to support real-world data.
Great. And that last point you made was very important. Another question for you: how do you see your hospital adapting and changing to improve outcomes based on real-world data learning regarding diversity?
That's a tough one, and I guess my answer there is we're still learning, right? This is a hot topic right now, and I think we're all trying to figure out ways to adapt and change to be more inclusive and change based on outcomes that we glean from these studies. So. And from the data set. So I don't know the answer to this just yet. And I think everyone's trying, everyone's willing, and everyone's earnestly looking for an answer, but whether we have the actual, and I think the first step is the willingness to adapt and change. And I think that's there. To effect change, though, it requires so many steps and so many moving parts in an entity that's probably established in its ways and being used to doing things a certain way. And so to change that and to change the way you're doing things is a difficult process to undertake. So I think that stay tuned. I think we're still trying to figure that out as we move through this.
Great, thank you. Here's another question about how are social determinants of health being captured in real-world evidence, and what databases are validated for use for real-world evidence. So I'm sure probably no one on the call wants to kind of specifically endorse any specific data source. But could you talk about how you're able to get at social determinants of health, both race and ethnicity, but also other social determinants of health, like income, for example? And Jamie, you mentioned that you're using zip code, 3-digit zip code, as a proxy of social determinants of health. But I know that there are sometimes other things that are used are pollution, purchasing, purchasing activity in the area. Don't know if you have any experience with that kind of geographic information system targeting.
I don't, but I know some of my AI ML team uses census data to help pair that, right, with this national registry data and zip code data to create a population or a peek at what a targeted area looks like for us and for our trials. So we use census data plus zip code. I don't know if anyone else has, maybe Dr. Bowen, if you have insight into some of the other data sets.
No, I've seen typically zip code used. We've also seen more data on location of vascular clinician deserts, looking at how close the nearest clinician is, because that's a determinant if you don't have access to particular care with, as I mentioned, with chronic limb-threatening ischemia, access to wound care is huge. There are areas of the country where it's hours to the nearest interventionalist or wound care facility. So I've seen those used also.
Thanks. Here's another question. What are your thoughts about using real-world data to better select trial locations that are more diverse?
We are seeing this, we've seen it used a couple of times. I think it's really important, is depending on the patient population you're looking at. Real-world data may be used to find, as I said, pediatric patients or patients of a particular demographic, particularly if those patients have a unique characteristic or rare disease, or we understand the generalization associated with that. Some registries have site selection tools to find overlap between particular patient demographic or particular sites. We ourselves are using a tool. We're doing some research looking at a site selection tool to overlap with dialysis centers in order to find sites that have particular interventionalists and dialysis centers to be able to enroll, say, patients with chronic kidney disease. So I think it's useful, just making sure we don't get too far away from being able to generalize it to other patients in the American patient population.
Yeah, one of the things we've been doing is some people on our team built use Medicare data, which you can get down to county level, and looked at for procedures that were relevant to our enrollment, comparing the rates of procedures amongst different race ethnicity groups by men and women. So we could look at what's the disparity in the rates of procedures between different ethnicities by county, and as well as the census information. And so that we've used that to help sites, help to target sites that we initially include, but also oftentimes when we will work with a hospital system, and they'll have 4 or 5 different hospitals that could participate in the research. So we can actually help them identify which hospital in their system would be the best hospital to include in the study.
Yeah, these tools, right, that you're coming up with to actually help the sites, tremendously beneficial to them to tap into the patient subsets that they may not be aware of, and to actually focus their resources on how to recruit and screen patients that are relevant to the trials, right? As opposed to sort of some of these broad brushstrokes where they yield no patients. It's really much more targeted. I think the sites really appreciate that. And we don't get too involved, right? We just say, here's an algorithm, here's some data sets, some tools that can help you based on metrics that we can see objectively. You all do with it what you want at the site level. Yeah.
John, have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, so outside of not with specific tools like that, but as far as your initial question about using the Medicare database and even local Department of Health databases on what where the prevalence of disease state is within the state, so within a geographic location. So going back to Ms. T's area of expertise with amputations, for example, we know specifically to the zip code where the highest amputation rates are. And so when you're targeting a patient population with limb-threatening ischemia, if you're able to target institutions that are within those zip codes, or being able to enroll patients from those zip codes, that would be key. And so those are ways where we've tried to penetrate some of these disease subsets, but it still becomes challenging because there are other confounding variables, like I mentioned earlier, that prevents patients even from those areas to come in for those trials, and so there are a lot of things to consider, but I think digesting that data from whatever source that you can get, whether it's from zip codes, from Medicare databases, from Department of Health data sets, I think it would be helpful.
So overcoming the operational challenges or obstacles for people to come into the sites.
Yeah.
We have, I think, time for one last question. Is it suitable to use FDA adverse event data, the more data, as part of real-world data to support research in terms of safety and long-term efficacy among different products? Presumably by looking at race, ethnicity, or gender differences, could you use the adverse event data? And if yes, what kind of statistical indicator would be recommended?
So I don't know if our adverse event data captures down to race, ethnicity. Typically it doesn't, unless the they include it in the narrative. I think our database is useful, but there are limitations associated with it. It's more a passive collection of data. There may be multiple instances of the same adverse event if a clinician submitted it, industry submitted it, and perhaps a patient. And if it was in literature, there may be 4 instances of the exact same adverse event. So there are some limitations associated with that data. I do believe it could be hypothesis generating. We do look at this data to see if there are trends over time with particular devices. If we have folks that do trending analyses. So it is helpful, but we're also, many times those data are lacking a denominator, how many devices sold. If a device has 26 adverse events, but 26 were sold, that's concerning. But if 26,000 were sold, that's less concerning because the device is functioning safe and effectively most of the time. So I think there are limitations with those data, but we do use them to look at trending analysis over time. And usually it's a bit of a judgment call, and we speak with our clinicians on the topic. So that's my experience with the adverse event data. I don't know if clinicians or others have used it to look at trending analyses or make clinical decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that and just say that it depends on what the question you're asking is. And yes, it's great for negative outcomes, but that's it, right? It's the adverse events. And so you're not seeing where the positive outcomes are actually occurring. And so it's hard to tell. It depends on what question you're asking. If it is specifically looking at adverse events, then I think it's a very helpful database without having the granularity of the demographics of the patient involved in it, but at least just knowing what the adverse event is. Or the penetration of adverse events is. So I think you have to take it with a grain of salt, depending on what the question is, and also recognize that you're not seeing perhaps a vast majority of patients where there is a beneficial outcome utilizing the exact same device.
So you could possibly use it to look at safety, but definitely not efficacy. But as Misty pointed out, it doesn't capture race unless it's put in the narrative. So you could do an NLP search for race and ethnicity, but then you're only going to get a subset of reports that will include it. So in terms of metrics, one of the things we found very helpful for looking at these type of questions using adverse event reports is the disproportionality index, which was originally developed by Stephen Evans at the University of London. It's been used quite a lot by C. Burr and C. Durr, and could be a useful tool for medical devices too. But the absence of race being systematically captured would be would make it difficult. Now, FDA could consider adding a race ethnicity field, not just relying on the narrative, which would make research, it's used for looking at diversity specific issues easier, but there would be, there's obviously political implications of doing that would have to be considered. Well, for our closing question, I'd like to ask the panelists what your call to action is and what's your takeaway from this discussion today. The call to action and takeaway. Jamie, perhaps you'd like to start.
I was going to go John first. Okay. So one of the call to actions that we've actually put in place as a result of everything that's been going on the past couple of years is we're asking every single one of our employees at the company level, not just within clinical research, at the company level, to get involved in any type of D&I initiative. It can be within the company and it can be external to the company. We don't care what it is, but we're asking everyone to get involved, because the more you get involved and participate, the more you learn, and we break down the barriers. And the more we learn and we break down the barriers, the better and faster we're going to be able to change and pull these minoritized communities in off the sidelines and actually develop better medical devices and pharmaceuticals. So that's something that we started a few years ago. I continue to do it. One of the things that I continue to learn on every single one of these calls is how multifaceted this issue is, right? Just when we think we've solved one piece, you realize, nope, there are 10 other layers to this that we haven't solved. And so what I keep taking away is, don't be afraid of your data. Don't be afraid of the data. Set meaningful small metrics every month, every quarter, every year that you and your team can try to target and achieve, because if we're all doing this, over a really short period of time, we actually start to make meaningful change. But if we're afraid of the data and we're afraid that someone's going to judge us on it, we're never going to change this. So we've been starting to put small, meaningful metrics in place and trying to achieve those targets.
Thank you. That's great. Misty.
So I think our draft guidance would be my call to action. I'm looking forward to reviewing some of these plans. We've been excited in some of our peripheral trials. We're seeing an increase in the women who are included in clinical trials. We've seen upwards of 50% in some of our trials, which is much higher than the typical 25, 30%. So that's been exciting. And then many of our trials are starting to be more representative of the American patient population. So I've at least seen in our industry, they are very interested in doing this. They're interested in understanding outcomes in race and ethnicity and gender and other subgroups, and how we can I just bring the awareness, understand the disparities, and find a way to move forward together. As I'd also like to add, as part of I'm a manager, and so one thing I've been bringing to my group at work is the understanding of the disparities. Just today, we had a clinician from the Mississippi Delta present to us on his challenges in treating Black Americans in the Delta with very limited resources, and who are very likely to get amputations if they show up at the hospital. How do we stop that? How do we help these patients to be treated with either interventional means or not end up in the hospital in the first place? So we're also trying to bring awareness internally at FDA, and then reach out and help spread that awareness. And what can we do to help, guide the boat so that we understand some of these differences?
Excellent. It's great to hear FDA so motivated and engaged. And last but by no means least, John.
So, I mean, we had such great answers from the rest of my co-panelists. So I'm going to take a piece of everything that they said. I think Jamie first mentioned that this is so multifaceted. I think that is key, just recognizing that there are so many aspects to just being inclusive and being equitable in how we, parse the data and even enroll patients into these clinical trials is going to be key. And then what you're seeing here is really how multidisciplinary this needs to be, right? It's not just the clinician, it's not just the industry partner, it's not just the FDA. It's there's so many pieces to who's involved in really making a difference to affect change, and so that's going to be critical as well. And then finally, to take from Misty, this idea of awareness, I think. This is what we're doing here today is a big piece. It's really just having these discussions in multiple formats, different formats in different settings, and making this part of national meetings, as we discussed earlier, having sessions on this with panelists and having conversations would be an important step to figuring it out, because I don't think any of us really have all the answers. It's just really trying to talk about this, bring this out into the open, and being able to find ways around it. And so I think those are my bits that I take away from this session today.
Thank you, John. Yeah, for me, I think I'm very heartened that we're having this discussion today to address what has been historical inequities and current inequities. And I think, as Jamie said, it's about small. We don't the plans to meet FDA's guidance don't have to be perfect. The fact that we're taking steps, that everyone is taking steps towards addressing this, is really a powerful move towards in the right direction. I think just practically, some of the questions touched on a couple of issues that are areas for us to keep working on, such as better clarification of what types of social determinants of health are available, where can you access those, which databases have a race ethnicity in, actually, I think even an interesting student project would be to look at the more data and look at what race ethnicity data is in that, using NLP, just characterizing that. So just improving our tools, improving the clarity of our tool set, so that we know that as we go into the time where we have to deliver on the FDA guidance, how do we do that, and what are the resources available for people to do that, including the small investigators and small researchers, as Molly was asking about. So with that, we'll close our panel. Thank you very much to the audience for your questions, for your participation, and for showing up tonight. Thank you so much to our speakers, Misty, John, and Jamie. You've been excellent, and thank you for your commitment to this area. And we look forward to continuing this discussion and this journey together.
And thank you, Paul, for being an excellent moderator today. You did a great job. I know this is hard when we're doing it virtually, but that was fantastic. I'm going to put my MedTech color hat on for just a minute, and I want to say thank you to all of the sponsors who sponsored this event today, and for the members who continue to support the work of the MedTech Color Collaborative. Please visit our website and check us out on the LinkedIn page for more information on either MedTech Color or the MedTech Color community. Please also look for a follow-up survey where you can give feedback on today's event and or any sessions of interest in the future that we can convene panels on for further dialogue. This webinar recording will be posted to the website and other social media channels in the coming days. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Jamie. And let me just do a quick call out of thanking the two organizers I know of, Danielle Ariano and Molly van der Kar. Appreciate you organizing this.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye now.